Message few believed was real, and an unexpected invitation carrying the weight of old fractures and unfinished conversations. Sandringham had witnessed reconciliations before, but this felt different. Palace watchers noticed unusual movement, unusual silence, and one question spreading through royal circles. Why now? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, it was dismissed in the way royal rumors often are, quietly, cautiously, and with just enough distance to avoid becoming a headline. There had always been speculation surrounding private communication within the family. Messages sent, messages ignored, invitations extended only to disappear into silence. But according to reports circulating among royal commentators and observers, this particular invitation carried a different atmosphere altogether. It wasn't tied to a public event. It wasn't connected to a holiday appearance. A SAN emerged, a ceremonial gathering, or an official duty. Instead, whispers suggested something more unusual. A private invitation connected to Sandringham itself. That detail changed everything. Because Sandringham has never existed merely as another royal residence in the public imagination. It occupies a strange place inside the monarchy's story, a retreat, a family space, a location often associated with difficult conversations hidden behind routine appearances. Generations have passed through its halls carrying celebrations, tensions, and moments of quiet recalculation, which is exactly why reports of an unexpected gathering immediately ignited speculation. Why Sandringham? Why now? And perhaps most importantly, who wanted this meeting badly enough to make it happen? Observers began noting subtle signs. Commentators who normally dismissed reconciliation stories became noticeably more cautious. Royal correspondents described unusual restraint in palace messaging. No broad denials, no immediate, mashed clarifications, just silence. And in royal life, silence has a way of becoming louder than announcements. According to various interpretations circulating in royal coverage, preparations surrounding the reported invitation appeared unusually discreet. Staff movements were said to be controlled. Information reportedly remained limited to a narrow circle. There were suggestions that schedules became less transparent than usual. None of it confirmed. None of it officially acknowledged. Yet together, those details created the exact conditions that allow speculation to grow. Then attention shifted to one person, Prince William. Because if an invitation truly existed, the real question was never whether it had been sent. The real question was whether he would accept. For years, public narratives around William had centered on continuity, responsibility, and protecting institutional stability. His public role had increasingly become tied to restraint rather than reaction. Every appearance measured, every comment carried consequence. And because of that, the possibility of a private meeting carried emotional implications far beyond family dynamics. This wasn't simply about reopening communication. At least in the public imagination, it became something larger, a test, a moment suspended between protocol and memory. Reports and speculation quickly filled the vacuum. Some suggested this could represent an attempt at rebuilding trust. Others argued it might simply reflect practical realities inside an evolving monarchy. More skeptical voices questioned whether reconciliation narratives had become their own recurring tradition, appearing, disappearing, and returning whenever public interest reached its peak. Yet fascination only intensified, because people weren't responding to facts alone. They were responding to possibility. The possibility that beneath years of distance, public statements, competing narratives, and carefully maintained boundaries, there might still exist mass conversations the public never sees. And if Sandringham had become the setting for one of those conversations, then every small detail suddenly felt significant. Every movement, every silence, every unanswered question. But the invitation itself was only the beginning. The real tension began the moment William had to decide whether to walk through that door. For years, distance had become routine. Then came a decision that insiders would later describe as unusually deliberate. Not a public statement, not a formal response, but a private appearance. If the previous chapter of this story had been defined by silence, this one became defined by something far more difficult to interpret: intention. Because according to the growing wave of speculation surrounding the reported invitation, the question was no longer whether contact had been initiated. The question had become whether Prince William would allow the distance that had hardened over time to remain untouched, or whether quietly and Without ceremony, he would step into a conversation that nobody expected to happen. That possibility alone transformed the atmosphere. For years, William's public image had become increasingly connected to one idea above all others: stability. Not excitement, not unpredictability, stability. While headlines shifted and narratives evolved around him, his role appeared increasingly fixed: protect continuity, avoid unnecessary disruption, move carefully, speak less, carry more. It was a reputation built not through dramatic declarations but through consistency, which is exactly why reports of a private appearance generated immediate fascination, because deliberate decisions create louder echoes than emotional ones. According to various interpretations circulating among commentators and royal observers, those close to institutional thinking would likely view any private meeting through a difficult lens, not as a personal moment alone, but as something larger and an event carrying symbolic significance. Unashed quantities, whether intended or not. Every private gesture involving senior royals eventually becomes public meaning. Every attempt at normality becomes interpretation, and that creates pressure. Reports and speculation suggested that caution may have surrounded the decision-making process. Some observers argued that advisors would naturally favor restraint. Others suggested that maintaining clear boundaries remained essential after years of public complexity. None of those discussions were confirmed, but together they painted the image of a difficult calculation taking place behind closed conversations. Not anger, not refusal, calculation. Because there is a difference. The challenge wasn't simply whether to attend, it was what attendance might mean. Would showing up signal forgiveness? Would absence signal permanence? Would a private meeting create expectations no one intended to fulfill? Questions multiplied faster than answers. And underneath those questions sat something more human, mathing harder to quantify than protocol: history. Because public narratives often reduce relationships into headlines and timelines, but private relationships rarely move with that kind of simplicity. Previous tensions, conflicting interpretations, years of distance, and moments already absorbed into public memory don't disappear because one invitation appears. If anything, they become heavier, which made every reported detail surrounding this decision feel unusually loaded. Observers pointed to another presence around the story, not through statements, but through absence. Catherine. Not because she became the center of attention, but because she didn't. In moments of heightened speculation, silence often attracts its own meaning. Commentators began discussing the symbolic weight of restraint itself. No public signaling, no visible positioning, just quiet continuity. Some interpreted that as confidence. Others interpreted it as discipline. But nearly everyone agreed on one thing: Noth. Yang about this moment felt impulsive, and perhaps that was what unsettled people most. Because dramatic moments are easy to understand, measured ones rarely are. If reconciliation was being considered even in the smallest sense, what exactly would reconciliation mean? A conversation? A reset? A public image adjustment? Or simply two people agreeing that not every chapter has to remain frozen forever? Nobody seemed to know, and uncertainty became the story. Because once the possibility of movement exists, people immediately begin imagining outcomes. Yet before anyone could decide what William's choice truly represented, attention suddenly shifted elsewhere. And if William's appearance raised eyebrows, Meghan's arrival raised entirely different questions. Returning to familiar ground can feel stranger than leaving it. And for Meghan, every step carried years of headlines, assumptions, and unresolved history. By the time attention shifted toward the possibility of her arrival, the story already changed shape. This was no longer simply a question of whether communication existed or whether private conversations had taken place. The conversation had become something larger and far more difficult to untangle: a question of what returning means after years spent redefining distance. Because departures are often dramatic, returns rarely are, and that contrast became impossible to ignore. For years, public memory had attached itself to a sequence of moments that seemed impossible to separate from one another. Official exits, public appearances, interviews interpreted from every angle, competing narratives about responsibility, independence, pressure, and identity. Supporters saw one story, critics saw another. Observers built entire frameworks trying to explain what had happened and why. But beneath all of that lived a quieter reality. Time had passed. Roles had evolved. Public positions had hardened. which made the idea of entering a place so closely tied to family memory. Malik, not because a location changes people, but because certain places carry versions of ourselves we thought had already been left behind. Reports and speculation surrounding the gathering suggested unusually controlled arrangements. Commentators noted that discussions focused less on ceremony and more on precision. If meetings happened, they were imagined as carefully structured. If arrivals occurred, observers assumed discretion mattered. No broad gestures, no dramatic declarations, no obvious effort to turn private moments into public theater. That alone became part of the intrigue. Because royal stories often operate in reverse. The less people see, the more people believe meaning exists. And so attention turned toward interpretation. What would entering Sandringham represent now? Would it suggest unfinished conversations finally being acknowledged? Would it simply reflect civility rather than closeness? Would appearing in the same place mean anything at all? The questions multiplied because nobody could answer them with certainty. Observers began comparing present possibilities against older narratives, not to establish truth, but to measure contrast. Years earlier, discussions had centered on separation, departure, and defining new boundaries. Now speculation centered on presence, restraint, and whether coexistence itself had become meaningful. That shift felt significant. Not dramatic, not triumphant, just significant. Because in stories shaped by public memory, expectations become difficult to escape. Some voices interpreted any appearance as evidence of gradual healing. Others rejected that entirely. They argued that maturity and reconciliation are not the same thing, that people can share space without rewriting history, that respect does not automatically become closeness. And perhaps that was the most interesting possibility of all. What if this moment wasn't about repairing the past? What if it was about changing expectations for the future? The more observers debated, the less certainty anyone seemed to have. Staff speculation reportedly grew. Commentators dissected timing, tone, and symbolism. Public fascination expanded because the details remained frustratingly incomplete. Every unanswered question became its own headline. Yet something unexpected began happening beneath the surface. The story became less about conflict and more about ambiguity. And ambiguity unsettles people, because conflict gives audiences sides. Ambiguity gives them doubt. If this was reconciliation, it looked different than people expected. If this was only civility, it carried unusual emotional weight. And if this was neither, then perhaps the public had misunderstood the meaning of the moment entirely. But the meeting itself wasn't what stunned observers most, it was what happened afterward. No cameras, no statements, no official photographs. Yet silence often creates louder headlines than speeches ever could. And that was exactly what next. After days of speculation surrounding invitations, arrivals, and what each decision might symbolize, the public reached the moment everyone thought they had been waiting for: the meeting itself. Only there was a problem. Nobody knew what happened. No images emerged to anchor interpretation. No carefully measured statement appeared to frame the narrative. No official confirmation arrived to close the story neatly and send everyone home with answers. Instead, there was absence. And absence has always had a strange power around royal stories. It creates space. And once space appears, people begin filling it. Reports quickly shifted away from questions of logistics and towards something harder to measure: conversation. According to circulating interpretations and commentary, discussions centered on the possibility that a private exchange had taken place away from public attention. Not ceremonial, not strategic in appearance, just private. That possibility alone carried enormous weight because private discussions inside public families rarely stay private for long, not in meaning, even when details remain hidden. But no details came, and paradoxically that made the moment feel bigger. Commentators who had spent days predicting outcomes suddenly found themselves working with almost nothing. Analysts began speaking in careful language. Royal observers searched for patterns. Every word became conditional. Every conclusion became temporary. What was discussed? Nobody knew. Who spoke first? Nobody knew. How long did the conversation last? Again, nobody knew. Yet uncertainty didn't reduce interest. It multiplied it, because once details disappear, interpretation becomes the event. Observers turned to smaller things, not facts, but signals. The language surrounding the moment became unusually cautious. Public discussions shifted away from certainty and into possibility. People began reading meaning into restraint itself, and that was when something unexpected happened. Body language, whether observed directly, reported indirectly, or simply imagined through public discussion, started becoming part of the story. Not because anyone could prove anything, but because people instinctively search for emotion when words disappear. Commentary began dividing into camps. Some interpreted the silence as positive. They argued that meaningful conversations rarely emerge with immediate declarations. That distance, once created, doesn't disappear dramatically, it softens quietly. Others disagreed. They suggested that silence can mean boundaries just as easily as healing, that politeness and resolution are not the same thing, that private discussion may simply represent acknowledgement rather than reconciliation. And suddenly the conversation evolved again. People stopped asking whether they met. People started asking what the meeting meant, because beneath every interpretation sat deeper questions that had nothing to do with a single afternoon and everything. To do with the future, family, legacy, responsibility, distance. How much of the past should remain untouched? How much of the future should remain open? Can relationships change without becoming what they once were? Those questions spread quickly because they reached beyond individuals. They touched something broader, something people recognized in their own lives. The possibility that closure does not always arrive as a dramatic moment. Sometimes it arrives as a conversation nobody else gets to hear. Yet the more people tried to interpret the silence, the stranger the atmosphere became. Media narratives began pulling in different directions. Some described cautious optimism. Others emphasized emotional distance. Some framed the moment as symbolic. Others rejected symbolism entirely. And then, just as the speculation seemed ready to fade, a new detail surfaced. Small enough to sound insignificant, powerful enough to change the conversation completely. Then came the detail that made a private moment into public speculation. Sometimes a single gesture becomes more important than the conversation itself, and royal history is filled with moments exactly like that. That was the strange shift no one expected. After all the anticipation surrounding the reported meeting, after the speculation about invitations, decisions, and private discussions hidden from public view, the moment that captured attention wasn't a statement. It wasn't an announcement. It wasn't even confirmation that anything meaningful had been resolved. It was something smaller. And because it was smaller, people paid even closer attention. According to the wave of commentary that followed, attention quickly narrowed around reports of a brief exchange after the private moment had ended. Nothing dramatic, nothing officially described. No verified account explaining exactly what was said or what happened. Just scattered interpretations built around timing, atmosphere, and the possibility that something subtle had occurred. That possibility was enough. Because royal history has trained people to believe that the quietest moments sometimes carry the greatest symbolic weight, observers began drawing comparisons not because circumstances were identical, but because public memory tends to organize itself through familiar patterns. Earlier moments of royal tension, periods of distance followed by limited appearances, measured interactions interpreted as thawing relations, those comparisons returned almost instantly. And as they returned, so did an uncomfortable question. How do people know when a moment matters? Is it because something changed? Or because people desperately want to believe something changed? That tension began shaping every conversation. Some interpreted the reported exchange as meaningful precisely because it seemed understated. No headlines declaring unity. No orchestrated messaging. Just the suggestion of normal human interaction after years of assumptions and competition. Narratives. Others resisted that interpretation entirely. They argued that civility should not automatically become reconciliation. That respect does not erase history. That appearing in the same place does not mean arriving at the same understanding. And suddenly the debate became less about the exchange itself and more about what people needed it to represent. Online discussion intensified. Not because new facts emerged, but because interpretations multiplied. One group framed the moment as evidence that difficult relationships can evolve quietly. Another saw it as institutional maturity rather than personal closeness. Others questioned whether public fascination had transformed ordinary gestures into extraordinary symbolism. The conversation accelerated because nobody could prove anything, which meant everyone could imagine everything. And buried beneath all of those reactions was another layer entirely. William, Because once speculation moved beyond the meeting, attention naturally. My ally returned to what this might mean for him. Not immediately, not dramatically, but inevitably. For years, discussions around his future role had focused on continuity, structure, and long-term stewardship. Public expectations had gradually shifted from watching his present to imagining his future. Every decision began carrying a larger shadow, and so questions emerged. If moments like this happen, what do they reveal? Strength? Flexibility? Discipline? Does protecting stability mean holding boundaries forever? Or does it sometimes mean knowing which doors to leave unlocked? Nobody seemed able to agree. Yet perhaps that uncertainty became the most revealing part of all. Because if this moment represented anything, it wasn't certainty. It was complexity. The possibility that relationships can remain complicated and still become quieter. The possibility that history doesn't disappear but stops demanding to be repeated. And just as people began settling into that interpretation, another mashed realization emerged. Moments people call reconciliations rarely unfold the way audiences expect them to, but reconciliation stories rarely end where people expect. Behind every emotional royal story sits another force entirely, the institution itself, and that was where the tone of the story changed again. Because while public attention remained fixed on possibilities of reconciliation, private conversations, and symbolic gestures, another process had already begun, one that rarely appears in headlines, but often determines how those headlines are remembered. Management, not of people, of meaning. That is the strange reality surrounding modern monarchy. Personal moments may attract attention, but institutions survive by controlling interpretation. Every silence communicates something. Every appearance creates consequence. Every unanswered question becomes a decision in itself, which meant that if the reported meeting and its aftermath had created momentum, there would almost certainly be another calculation happening in parallel. Not emotional, strategic. According to ongoing commentary and public interpretation, observers began noticing something familiar in the aftermath. Restraint. No rush to define events. No visible effort to transform speculation into narrative. No broad campaign to shape public opinion. At first glance, that absence seemed passive. But some argued it may have been intentional, because institutions rarely react quickly when ambiguity serves a purpose. And suddenly attention shifted away from what happened and toward what wasn't happening. Why no clarification? Why no confirmation? Why allow uncertainty to grow? Those questions became increasingly difficult to ignore. Royal communication has always operated differently from ordinary public life. It rarely tries to satisfy curiosity completely. Instead, it often attempts something more delicate, acknowledging attention without becoming controlled by it. That balance matters. Too much openness risks creating expectations. Too much silence risks creating speculation. And somewhere between those two pressures sits the strategy of continuity. Because whatever private emotions may exist, institutions think in longer timelines. Commentators began discussing the possibility that this moment had become larger than the people involved. Not because individuals stopped mattering, but because public reactions had started creating consequences beyond personal relationships. Every headline became part of a wider story. Every interpretation became a signal. Questions emerged about optics. If a private meeting appeared too warm, people would declare transformation. If it appeared too distant, people would declare failure. If no explanation came, audiences would create their own. There was no perfect outcome, only choices with different consequences, and that may explain why silence began taking on new meaning. Not avoidance, containment, because once public fascination accelerates, institutions and I often stop trying to win narratives and start trying to outlast them. Yet this story refused to slow down. Media discussion expanded far beyond immediate observers. Commentary multiplied across platforms, countries, and audiences. Some framed the moment as evidence of gradual evolution. Others viewed it as carefully maintained distance dressed in symbolism. Each interpretation pulled the story further away from its origin. And perhaps that was the irony. What began as speculation about one reported invitation had become a global conversation about family, expectations, and the future of public roles. By then, it no longer mattered whether people agreed. The conversation itself had become the event. But beneath all of the institutional caution sat an uncomfortable reality. No matter how carefully narratives are managed inside palace walls, meaning doesn't stay there forever. Because institutions can influence interpretation, they cannot contain reaction. And while silence continued pro-Monarchy, detecting whatever happened behind closed doors outside those walls, something else had already started. Yet outside the palace walls, another battle had already begun. The meeting may have happened in private, but its meaning was rewritten in public. And once that happened, the story no longer belonged to the people at its center. Because private moments can remain private only for so long. Eventually they leave the room they happened in and enter something much larger, public imagination. And once that transition happens, meaning becomes unstable. People stop asking what occurred and begin deciding for themselves what it must have meant. That was the shift unfolding now. What had started as speculation surrounding an invitation, then transformed into discussion about appearances, silence, and symbolism, suddenly became something broader. Interpretation at scale. Supporters moved first. For some, the reported meeting became less about personalities and more about possibility. They interpreted even the suggestion of private contact as evidence that difficult relationships do not always remain frozen forever. They argued that maturity rarely announces itself dramatically. That growth sometimes looks disappointingly ordinary. No declarations, no public reset. Just people choosing conversation over permanent distance. That interpretation spread quickly because people wanted to believe it. Not necessarily because of monarchy, but because people understand complicated relationships. Families fracture. Expectations collide. Time changes people. And the idea that distance does not have to become destiny carries emotional power far beyond royal life. But not everyone accepted that reading. Critics questioned timing. Others questioned motives. Some argued that symbolism had overtaken substance, that public fascination was creating meaning where none existed. They pointed out that appearances can be interpreted endlessly and warned against turning limited information into sweeping ICG conclusions. Different voices ask difficult questions. If reconciliation exists, what does it actually change? If nothing changes publicly, was the moment meaningful at all? If civility replaces conflict, is that healing or simply coexistence? Those questions intensified because there were no clear answers to challenge them. Then social media did what social media always does. It accelerated everything. Small observations became narratives. Narratives became camps. Camps became certainty. One interpretation described the moment as a quiet turning point. Another framed it as strategic optics. Others rejected both ideas and insisted the public had become more invested in the story than the participants themselves. And somewhere inside that noise, the conversation quietly changed shape again. People stopped focusing on individuals. They started talking about legacy. Because once public discussion reaches a certain scale, personalities become symbols. William stopped being discussed on like as a person and became connected to expectations surrounding future leadership. Meghan stopped being discussed only as an individual and became attached to wider debates about change, identity, and public reinvention. Suddenly, the conversation wasn't about one reported meeting anymore. It became about generations. What does continuity look like now? How much tradition survives adaptation? Can institutions evolve without appearing unstable? What do younger audiences expect from public figures compared to previous generations? Questions like these began surfacing everywhere because they reflected something bigger than royal life. They reflected changing expectations themselves. And perhaps that was why the story remained impossible to close. Because no statement had been released, no outcome had been announced, no final interpretation had won. Yet the discussion kept expanding, not because people needed certainty, but because uncertainty invited participation. By now, the meeting had become almost secondary. The real event was what people projected onto it: hope, skepticism, change, continuity, repair, distance. And in the end, the question was never whether they met, it was what the moment represented. Royal history rarely moves in dramatic leaps. More often it changes through quiet decisions made behind closed doors. And perhaps that is the reason stories like this never truly end. Because by the time public attention begins searching for a final answer, the people at the center of the moment have often already moved on. Conversations become memories. Headlines become archives. Certainty dissolves. Yet the meaning people attach to those moments continues evolving long afterward. That is where this story arrives in its final chapter. Not with confirmation, not with resolution, but with reflection. Because if there was one place that came to represent everything people projected onto this moment, it was Sandringham. Not as a destination, not as a solution, but as a symbol. Over time, places connected to institutions begin carrying meanings far beyond geography. They become containers for memory. They absorb stories, whether those stories are true, exaggerated, incomplete, or entirely imagined. And eventually, people stop talking about what happened there and start talking about what it represents. That seemed to happen here. What began as speculation surrounding an invitation transformed into conversations about distance, duty, family, change, and expectations. The location itself became secondary. What mattered was the possibility people attached to it. Because reconciliation and resolution are not the same thing. That distinction may be the quiet truth sitting underneath every interpretation. Reconciliation suggests healing. Resolution suggests finality. But life, and perhaps especially public life, rarely offers finality. People can speak without agreeing. Families can evolve without returning to what they once were. History can soften without damage. A is appearing, and institutions can adapt without rewriting themselves. Maybe that was always the more difficult idea to accept, that not every story ends with restoration. Some end with understanding, others simply continue. As those broader questions lingered, attention inevitably returned to William, not because one moment determines a future, but because public expectations increasingly frame his role through a different lens now. For years, conversations about leadership often focused on continuity alone. Yet moments like this introduce a different question. What kind of continuity? The kind that protects distance, or the kind that allows space for complexity? People project those questions onto public figures because they are easier than asking them in their own lives. And that is why reactions became so emotional. Because the discussion stopped being about a reported meeting. It became about identity. About whether institutions remain strong by staying unchanged or by understanding. ICG when change no longer threatens them. And somewhere inside that conversation remained Meghan's place in the narrative. Complicated, debated, constantly reinterpreted. To some, she became part of a larger story about independence and reinvention. To others, she remained connected to unresolved tensions and difficult chapters. But perhaps the most revealing thing was this. Years later, the conversation still refuses simplicity. Because public narratives prefer heroes and villains, real life rarely cooperates. And in the end, that may be the lasting tension beneath everything. Family asks for emotion. Institutions ask for endurance. The space between those two forces is where stories like this continue to live. No declarations. No dramatic closing chapter. Just people, expectations, memory, and the endless public search for meaning inside private moments. Whatever truly happened, if anything happened at all, one truth remains. In royal life, silence is often the loudest headline of all. Watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.